Sewing of a sanitary pad. We have already cut out 2 flap pieces and 3 holding pieces for the sanitary pad in our previous session. In this session, we will see how to sew all the pieces together to make a sanitary pad. At the end of the session, you will be able to sew the fabric pieces for a sanitary pad. Let's first familiarize with the tools and materials required for sewing Amrita sanitary pads. We will require cut-out fabric pieces, button, hand sewing needle, matching thread, shears, and sewing machine. We have already cut 2 flap pieces and 3 holding pieces for sewing the sanitary pad. Now let's see how to sew all the cut-out pieces together for the sanitary pad. We will first sew the 2 flap pieces together. For this, first take one flap piece with its right side up. Place the other flap piece square with its right side down on top of the first flap piece. Now start sewing from a point at the middle of one side, leaving a seam allowance of 1/4 inch on all sides. Continue sewing on all 4 sides of the flap pieces till you reach 3 inches to 4 inches before the starting point. Now turn the fabric inside out. Press the seam on all the sides. We will now do a top stitched seam on all the 4 sides. Press the seam on all the 4 sides. We have finished sewing the 2 flap pieces for the sanitary pad. Now we will sew all the holding pieces. For this, first place the holding pieces of cotton fabric with the right sides facing each other. Now place the leak-proof fabric on top of the 2 holding pieces. Sew the 3 layers of the holding piece together, leaving a seam allowance of 1/4 inch. We will now sew only 3 sides, leaving one side open. Now turn the fabric inside out as shown. After turning the fabric, sew the open side also. We will now top stitch on all the sides. We will now fix the holding piece to the flap piece. For this, place the holding piece on top of the flap piece. Sew on the 2 opposite sides as shown. We will now fix a button on one side of the holding part and make buttonhole on the other side. For this, mark the center of the holding piece by folding the fabric as shown. Make a half-inch marking for making the buttonhole. Now make a slit in the marking on one side with shears for sewing a buttonhole. Sew a buttonhole with a buttonhole stitch or blanket stitch. Now sew a button on the opposite side. Fold the flap piece as shown and insert it inside the holding piece. Our sanitary pad is now ready. In this session, we have seen how to sew all the fabric pieces to make a sanitary pad. Before we conclude, let's take a look at the key steps involved in sewing of a sanitary pad. Step 1. Sew the two flap pieces with a 1/4 inch seam allowance with the right sides facing each other, leaving a gap of 3 inches to 4 inches from the starting point to turn the fabric inside out. Step 2. Do a top stitched seam on all sides. Step 3. Sew the 3 layers of the holding piece together, leaving a seam allowance of 1/4 inch, leaving one side open. Step 4. Turning the fabric inside out, sew the open side also. Step 5. Top stitch on all the sides of the holding piece. Step 6. Fix the holding piece to the flap piece and sew on the opposite sides. Step 7. Fix a button on one side of the holding part and make buttonhole on the other side. With that, we have come to the end of this session.